All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Happy Friday. It is March 14th. And how are you feeling about this 30-day ceasefire deal? What's going on here?
um, I'll be honest, I'm troubled by it. Not okay. Well, first of all, there was the offer. It was clearly something that the Russians could not accept. They had made it clear many, many times that they wouldn't accept a ceasefire without conditions. And we waited for a while for Putin to finally make a statement on the ceasefire, but he did that yesterday. And yes, as we expected, he said, "Yeah, this is a great idea, this ceasefire." But he was very, very diplomatic, very respectful. He said, "But what if?" Ukraine keeps on uh, receiving weapons and stockpiling weapons. What if Ukraine is able to continue mobilizing? It's not really mobilizing. It's a forced the conscription that we've seen. What if Ukraine continues to train? During this period, and then there are problems with monitoring. He brought up all these issues and said, these are concerns that have to be addressed, conditions that need to be met before we can really have a ceasefire that means something. So, yeah, it wasn't something. I would have been very surprised if he had accepted it. Again, they made it very clear that they didn't, and so yeah, he rejected it. Now the the big question, I think this was inevitable, and I think the real big question is how the U.S. was going to react to it. Um, and what we've seen, unfortunately, so far is not very encouraging. It's somewhat mixed, but the news came out shortly thereafter that the U.S. was imposing a whole set of new sanctions on Russia, on the gas, oil, and banking sectors in Russia. And they had suspended an exemption that the Biden administration had allowed for certain sanctioned banks. Biden actually had allowed them, I think, at the request of European countries, to conduct transactions through these banks for the purchase of oil mainly. And now that has been okay. That has been rescinded, that exemption. So now we have actually under Trump, an even more extensive, more comprehensive sanctions regime being imposed on Russia. And it seems like it seems to me that the U.S. is having trouble changing its ways. I mean, we've talked about how Trump, he's not a neocon. That's true, right? He doesn't believe in this globalistic vision of the neocons, but he is still a hegemon. I think that's the problem. So he doesn't really care if you adopt the American system and the American way of life, and in your country. That's the way the neocons want to kind of carry out a revolution in Trotsky fashion around the world, where everybody adopts the Western system. He doesn't care about that. Oh, if you want to be Chinese, that's fine with me. If you want to be Russian, you do things your way. Hey, but I'm the hegemon. And the hegemon gets to offer carrots but also to wield a stick. He doesn't do real diplomacy. In real diplomacy, you respect the other side. You look for common ground. You work together to find areas of common interest, and you try to, cooperate in those areas. And Marco Rubio had brought that up. He said we haven't been doing diplomacy. The truth is, the U.S. hasn't been doing diplomacy since the unipolar moment. Back in the old days of the Cold War, actually, we did do real diplomacy. We respected the Soviet Union. We worked together with them, and we succeeded in in drafting and then implementing these very, very important arms control treaties that made the world a much safer place. But I think since the unipolar moment, we've forgotten how to do diplomacy, and it's become a matter of carrots and sticks, and mostly sticks, really. And we see the same old bad habits resurfacing here. That immediately after the Russians refused to accept the ceasefire, he did it very diplomatically, but Putin refused to accept it. Well, the stick came out and whack, new sanctions. This is stupid. It's not going to do anything. It can only, sour relations. It's not going to change Russian behavior. The stick can work with a very weak country, like, let's say, Panama relative to the United States or Colombia, because these countries are just so much weaker. They have like 0.1% the power of the United States. And so they simply do have to bend. And we've seen that. We've seen them cave in quickly. But Russia is not one of those countries, and it's not going to bend. It's only going to sour relations. So that's a very disturbing signal. It really is. It's a return to the bad old Biden ways. At the same time, or shortly thereafter, I believe it was this morning, Mark Rutte, the General Secretary of NATO, made a statement that no, NATO is off, the table forever. No NATO for Ukraine, and that is a breakthrough. That's something that the Russians have been asking for. It's funny. Biden actually was the Biden administration. Who knows? It was actually Biden who figured this out, but the Biden administration never agreed to NATO membership in the foreseeable future anyway. They say, well, maybe someday, but no, we can't talk about that. We can't consider it. And I think they knew that, that was a stupid thing to do. But for whatever reason, they can never say a plain no. Yeah, it's not going to happen. If they had, like prior to the launch of the SMO in 2022, we might not have had this war at all, because that's one thing, of course, that the Russians were demanding. Can we say just no to NATO for Ukraine? And apparently, it's just like there was no desire really to offer NATO membership to Ukraine in the administration, even prior to the SMO. But they refused to actually make that clear no. They wanted it for, maybe as sort of a way of a potential threat against Russia, or it's just a matter of their sense of their own, hegemonic status. It's just like, we don't agree to things. People come and make requests like that, a rival power. That would show that we would actually kind of compromise a little bit, or regard them as an equal in this matter. So we just don't we don't give a clear answer, and they didn't. But Mark Rutte finally did. So that's a breakthrough. So it's like I said, there are mixed signals here. The imposition of the sanctions is very disturbing, and it's not gonna bear any good fruit. It has the potential for really definitely going to sour relations and make the Russians even more distrustful of the Americans. And it kind of reflects, or I think it indicates a failure to really adapt to the new reality. We've seen these breakthroughs. We've seen these very encouraging statements, or heard these very encouraging statements from different members of the administration and from Trump himself. But there have also been threats to impose new sanctions. We've heard that more than once. So this shouldn't be a complete surprise. It's a mixed bag. I think, again, I'll just kind of sum it up. It's like, okay, maybe they have abandoned the globalist project. They don't really have any interest in that. The one that had been pursued by the U.S. ever since the unipolar moment. But the old habits of the hegemon, don't die easily.
Yeah, you say we like to use sticks, these sanctions, but these haven't worked, right? It seems like we don't really have a stick worth that can really do any damage to Russia. So are these sanctions going to have any effect? Does it really matter?
Well, they'll have some effect, but it's clear. Again, Russia's made it clear. The last 3 years have made it clear that the sanctions don't work. And there's always the threat, well, the next package, that'll make the difference. The truth is that Russia is the largest supplier of commodities to the world. And the world needs those commodities. And really, in the short run, it's going to cause some discomfort, but there will be, like, as always, there are ways to work around these sanctions. The main discomfort is actually, I think, going to be to Europe, because Europe has continued to receive oil and gas from Russia. They're not receiving nearly as much as they did before. And, as a result, their energy prices have gone up significantly. And this has had a very negative impact on their economies, especially the industrial economy of Germany. But, it would have been worse if the cutoff had been total. Now, this helps to make it closer to total. It's going to make it worse. So, yeah, Europe, I think, as we've seen so far, is going to suffer more than anybody else. There's a prediction that, gas prices worldwide, gas meaning petroleum, for those who speak British English, are going to rise 5% as a result of this.
Well,
at least in the short run.
Do you think that Putin and Trump are aware that these sanctions don't really hurt Russia? I mean, the story of the sanctions since they started over the past 3 years is that Europe suffers, Russia thrives. That's really what's been happening. We've talked about how Russia has been posting 4% GDP growth year after year. The first year, a little bit of a dip. Last 2 years, right? But the first year of the SMO, a little bit of a dip. But really, we've seen a kind of almost an economic revival. It's very impressive, while Europe is deindustrializing. So in a way that these sanctions, they hurt Europe and they seem to help Russia, even though that they're directed at Russia. And it seems like you're hitting the stick at Russia, but you're really kind of just missing Russia and hitting Europe. And Trump isn't a fan of Europe. Putin's not a fan of Europe. Do you think could it be possible that there's an acknowledgement that, like, hey, sure, we'll do these sanctions. It'll hurt Europe more. They're crazy. They'll celebrate. Yes, they have, hooray, we're hurting more, but we're not using Russian gas. Fantastic, Yeah. Is that possible?
Well, it's possible. I say at the very least, when considering the sanctions, this was true under Biden too, though. Biden was actually supposed to be a friend of Europe, right? The European leaders liked him. He liked them. Yet he did more damage to the European economy, than Trump ever will. It's just that he just didn't care. I mean, it was, and I'm sure that Trump doesn't care if Europe suffers collateral damage. Again, it's not good for Russia, and then also it's a matter of Russian dignity and sovereignty. They're not going to cave into this. It's not going to have an effect. That's just, there's no question about it. Even though if it does do some damage to their economy, at least in the short run, it probably will. And I don't think anything very significant, but there are going to be losses as a result. I don't know. Again, it's very hard. There's always this argument that Trump is playing 5D chess. I just don't buy it. I just don't think he's that kind of person. He's actually very transparent. The sanctions were always on the table. He has used this language of threats. That's the way, he's talked in that way about Russia and about, every other country in the world, threatening countries with tariffs and whatever. This is the way he does business. So I don't think it's some sort of secret collaboration. It's Trump being Trump, but hopefully Trump has his, I wouldn't call it an angelic side, but he has some common sense, that seems to be missing among Western leaders in general. He does also have this kind of boastful side, which is real and is a problem. And let's just hope that, I think again the Russians will play it very cool. That they won't overreact to this, and they'll just they'll go ahead and they'll continue to try to talk to the Americans, and the Americans maybe will see Trump, and I think it's really possible that this didn't work, and go back to the negotiating table, and let's hope then that real progress is made.
Right. Yeah, I don't think that Trump was secretly collaborating with the Russians or Putin. It's just that there was kind of an awareness that, okay, we'll do this stick. It won't have that much of impact. It might boost our own American sales of liquid LNG or oil, whatever it is. And Putin's also aware that, okay, we've been sanctioned up for the past 3 years.
I don't think
It's
they
not
made it clear they're just not. They don't care.
right.
About
They're not too concerned. So it's not that big of a stick. But you're right. It's a real mixed bag. I mean, just while you were talking to me right there, I just had a pop up, BBC News alert pop up saying Trump calling with Putin. And so just right, I was just looking at RT News when I woke up this morning, and it's all over the place. You don't understand what's really happening between the relationship between Russia and the United States. Just a few of the headlines in the past 24 hours is U.S. eyes Arctic cooperation with Gazprom. Trump wants to meet with Putin, and we just got an alert that he's calling Putin. U.S.-Russia Nord Stream deal in talks. But then at the same time, I'll see in the same 24 hours, I'll see a headline that says U.S. to send upgraded long-range bombs, small diameter bombs to Ukraine. You know, so it's like, to me, that's a more serious kind of dent in, I think, in the negotiations is sending this type of weaponry to Ukraine at this point. It's like maybe my mind is like, maybe the Trump administration is just throwing everything at the wall, mixed bag. So each side can say that, yeah, we're getting what we want. Everybody's getting what they want. He just sees what sticks. Do you think?
Well,
maybe I'm being too generous to Trump. Well, it's a real mixed bag. I don't know what to make about it. Make of it. So
yeah, Trump himself is a mixed bag. That's the thing. You know, he does have these contradictory or often conflicting impulses, and I think we see, we're just seeing both sides of the man in this case. He clearly enjoys wielding the stick. What was it, Teddy Roosevelt that says, speak softly and wield a big stick. But Trump's idea is to, speak loudly and wield a big stick. That's the kind of person he is. I think that, again, so I don't, I think, he must, some people within his administration, clearly think that these sanctions can be effective. I think the Secretary of Treasury, Bessent, is one of them. He says, yeah, we can really, so we haven't gone nearly far enough. We can sanction the hell out of them. And Trump is thinking, yeah, maybe if I just apply the pressure, that Putin will come around and see that I'm a tough guy and that, okay, I mean business, unlike Biden. Of course, it's silly. I mean, again, Biden imposed over 24,000 sanctions. Okay, Trump has imposed another dozen. They may be more significant than
24,000?
Yeah, 24,000.
Okay,
there was at one point, I think a month or two ago, it was 24,311. I don't know where it is right now, but I think it's maybe still in the 24,000s. So, the idea that Biden didn't impose significant sanctions is ridiculous. He did. I mean, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, and its economy grew 4% over the last 2 years.
Year on year, right? So 4%.
Yeah, 4% twice, both times, right? Yeah. Right. So, in each of those 2 years, right? It's very. It's disturbing about those, the small diameter glide bombs. Those were first used, I think, about 2 years ago. And they were a total flop because the Russians very quickly figured out how to neutralize them using electronic warfare. And so just after, very quickly, the Ukrainians said, this stuff is garbage. We can't do anything with this. The Russians just immediately take control of these, and they never land where we want them to land. So apparently, I think Boeing makes them. Boeing went back to the drawing table, and they made modifications that are supposed to make them at least more impervious to or resistant to electronic warfare. And so we'll see. I think that they actually kind of strengthened and protected the inner circuitry. To shield it from EW measures, and we'll see how effective this new weapon proves to be. So, it is an escalation right there. It's an escalation that occurred under Trump. And then we also got the news, earlier we had been saying that, hey, there haven't been any ATACMS strikes since Trump took office. And I assumed that, okay, that he nixed the whole ATACMS project, launched by Biden, which included strikes into pre-2014 Russia. But then we got a report today, I think just this morning, no, I think it was yesterday actually, that I think it was the Associated Press, some news agency like that actually ATACMS, the Ukrainians' stock of ATACMS, was completely run down, totally depleted in January. So in other words, they just ran out of them.
Yeah, I saw that as well. Well, at least it doesn't seem like we don't make ATACMS anymore. This is the weird thing for me, as we talked a little bit about this, is that was kind of a major part of our arsenal.
Yeah.
We stopped producing them, and we haven't really replaced it with a new thing.
Yeah.
It's just there. Yeah. Do you know how long it takes for something like these upgraded small diameter glide bombs to be put into use? Like, was this announcement just made and it's going to be 3 months before they actually get to the front or are actually in use, or are they already there and they're going to be used?
Well, in the past, when these announcements have been made, we've learned that in fact the decision had been made quietly earlier and that deliveries had already begun, and so there may, in fact, we don't know for sure. This hasn't been confirmed officially, by the way, but they may in fact be there already, and we'll see. Now, I think, they could be an effective weapon, but I don't think they can compare with the Russian glide bombs, which are launched from their aircraft. Those can actually start at, I think, like 250 kilograms, 550 pounds, and go up to 3,000 kilograms. Again, these are small diameter bombs. I don't think they're anywhere near. I don't think they're. I think they're probably all much less than 250 kilograms. I don't know what the exact weight and size of these bombs is, but it's definitely going to be less than the FABs. The glide bombs that the Russians launch. So it may be helpful to the Ukrainians. It's not going to be a game changer, and I wouldn't be surprised if, in spite of the modifications, if the Russians don't figure out a way to neutralize them again.
So Marco Rubio, after he talked with Ukraine and said, "Oh, we got this 30-day ceasefire that we're going to present to the Russians. The ball's now in Russia's court." We saw Putin's response. Is the ball back in the U.S. court, or did they just sort of respond? Well, Putin and Trump might be talking right now. I don't know when that's happening, but it looks like it's happening soon. So we'll find out after this. Probably on Monday we'll have a big update. But maybe that's just what at least I'm feeling optimistic. I know there's some of this bad news to send the sanctions, sending weapons, but just the fact that now Trump is talking to Putin, don't you feel like that's quite encouraged by that? I mean,
again, that's the real breakthrough, and so there is reason to hope. Again, diplomacy is not possible without actual communication. That's the first step. And, again, we have a long ways to go. It's going to be a long and rocky road. And I don't know if we're ever going to get there or not. Again, there are a lot of forces arrayed against I think what are clearly Trump's intentions. He really does want to end the war. I don't doubt his intentions, so I'm not cynical in that way. But what I do lack confidence in his understanding, and also in the capabilities of his diplomats. Now, clearly some of them are very smart people. I'm actually surprised by Marco Rubio. I kind of tended to write him off as just another one of these, establishment Republicans. And, maybe that's what he is. But he's clearly, maybe not brilliant or anything, but he's a bright guy. And he seems to understand, figure things out pretty quickly. but he's also a novice, and they all are novices. One of the problems, again, he was talking about how we really haven't done diplomacy, as Marco Rubio himself admitted. We haven't done it for a long time, since the unipolar moment, really. We've just got in the habit of barking orders and wielding sticks, and just behaving like a hegemon. So the thing is that the whole ability to conduct this diplomacy has been greatly decreased within the U.S. administration, in the State Department in particular. We just don't have that core of experienced diplomats, who really know how to do this. Now the Russians do. Again, like Sergei Lavrov has been around since like the 1980s in the State Department, maybe even earlier. He started out there as not their State Department, I'm sorry, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. And so he's been there for a long, long time. And he is just a master of diplomacy. I think everybody admits that. Chas Freeman, Ambassador Chas Freeman, who was also the interpreter for Nixon in, his historic meeting with Mao Zedong. He says, yeah, he's probably the best diplomat in the world. And they have a very, very strong team. But on the U.S. side, we have, I'm not just saying that they're dumb and that they have evil intentions, but they are amateurs. They are very inexperienced. And maybe we can chalk this up to inexperience. This is not how you conduct diplomacy. But perhaps, just the fact that they're communicating is that maybe they'll learn how to conduct diplomacy. Let's hope.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think just the thing with Trump is whenever he speaks with somebody, he always wants to be liked. And so I think he always is very friendly. And I think I think Putin is a much wilier character than Zelensky, where I think he knows how to talk to Trump. So yeah. I hope that something good's going to come out of this phone call. But at the end of the day, though, Russia holds all the cards. I don't think Putin is really all that worried that much. I mean, really, even if, what can happen? The worst case scenario is a continuation of the Biden policy that we just keep on throwing money in there, right? But we're at this point where Ukraine can't really hold much longer. Maybe you can give us an update of what's happening on the front right now.
Right. Well, the Kursk collapse continues, and collapse is absolutely the right term. The Russians have now taken Sudzha. That was the only town of any size, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 people. And they have moved beyond Sudzha and are approaching the border, which is, I think now there are only 3 hamlets. We're talking about tiny places that are still under Ukrainian control, and those are probably going to last for another day or two. So it's basically over. It's really a mopping up operation now in Kursk, and the Ukrainians have just been fleeing, not in good order. There's some attempts to give this a good spin by Sersky and Zelensky or whatever. No, it's been total chaos, and many, many, many of these men have died, fleeing across the fields. They're out in the open and they're just gunned down, or they get in convoys. There's one famous example happened a couple of days ago where this convoy was fleeing south. This was right after that pipeline operation. That's really where the collapse began. They fled south, but the Russians had destroyed a bridge. It was actually a bridge that the Ukrainians themselves had on which they had installed bombs. They were planning to destroy it after they passed over, so it would make it more difficult for the Russians to pursue them. But what the Russians did is they saw that these explosives had been installed on this bridge, and they hit the explosives with a drone, and then it set it off. So the bridge was destroyed, and when the Ukrainians fled, they fled in a large convoy, and they got there, the bridge was gone. And then the entire convoy was destroyed. The Russians were just waiting for them in an ambush. That's just one example of what it's been a massacre. And these again are the some of the most elite units This was so important to Zelensky that he just put the best that he had into Kursk. He kept on pumping them in there, the most elite units and the best equipment. And it's all being wiped out right now. Again, there's very little left. It's basically all over. And in just a couple of days, it will be over. And in all likelihood, almost certainly the Russians are going to continue. They've already pushed into Sumy, and they're going to follow, these fleeing soldiers into Sumy. Putin, who was in the Kursk region just a couple of days ago, declared that there would have to be a buffer zone. So in other words, the Russians are planning to seize a large amount of territory in Sumy, just south of Kursk. So that's what's happening there. Now, in other parts of the line, there are a couple of areas. One is Toretsk, and the other is just south of Karakovo, I'm sorry, Povrovsk, where the Ukrainians have actually directed a lot of reserves to those areas and have launched some counterattacks, and they've had some minor success. But these, so they show that at least they're not completely, it's not over. They still have the ability to fight back, but these counterattacks it's clear that they won't be able to hold them. We've seen this happen again and again. Actually, there are many times when they'll concentrate forces in one area and counterattack, and they may take back a village or they may take back a small part of a city, but then within a couple of weeks, the Russians move in and consolidate. They're just not able to hold the territory that they take, and I think we can see that. In other places, though, the Russians have continued to advance. Several places along the front. So yeah, I think that's a fairly fair description of what's happening on the battlefields now.
So we can say on Kursk, it's a total collapse, right? It's done. And so, but there aren't really many fortifications behind that. So the movement through Sumy could be quite rapid. And that's a pretty direct line towards Kiev if they want to be moving that way, right?
That's correct, right. Okay, there is the city of Sumy, which is the capital of the Sumy region, and the road continues through Sumy onto Kiev. And it's really not all that far. So that's going to create a great deal of panic, I imagine, in Kiev if the Russians take the city of Sumy, or even when they approach it. The Kursk operation was just I've heard it described as a fool's crusade, and that's what it was. It made no sense from beginning to end. It was very poorly thought through, and I think we can see that. The person who really cooked it up was Zelensky himself, who just doesn't have any understanding of military affairs. He got a brief bump, in his information war. It was a public relations success when he first did it. But even back then, I remember that even back then you had whisperings, analysts in the Western media were saying, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. There's nothing of strategic value here. And I think most importantly, there's just it's an undeveloped area. There's just no place to hide there. It's not like, again, the Donbass, so much of the Donbass where it's a highly urbanized area with lots of, mines and factories and rivers crisscrossing, or these creeks that just create all kinds of natural barriers and fortifications. So the Donbass is much easier to defend, but there's nothing. You're out in the open, and so the losses there have been extraordinary. I think the Russians claimed that in Kursk alone, this was before the recent collapse. We're talking about like 2 weeks ago, before, when things really started to accelerate. It was before they started to accelerate. The Russians' Ministry of Defense stated that the Ukrainians had actually lost more equipment there than they did in all of the 2023 summer offensive. And they lost a lot of equipment in that. That was another disaster. It actually came out in the Western press too. I remember a story in it may have been the Washington Post or something like that. That the Ukrainians were losing equipment at double the rate that they were losing in Kursk than they were losing in other places like the Donbass. And it's obvious why. Again, they're out in the open. And not only are they out in the open, they don't have the air defense there. So Russian planes were able to fly directly overhead. And, in the end, it was a disaster that we've seen.
Right. I think when we look back on this conflict, there are two real huge military failures that just stand out that I think we'll study and wonder, how did they make these decisions? And that's the 2023 summer offensive, and then this Kursk operation, the right. Kursk offensive blocking. I mean, in your mind, could you kind of you already did a little bit, but a quick comparison on just how damaging they are, like what was the outcome of both of these events? Like, do you think these two things really crippled the Ukrainian army? Like, if it wasn't for this, we might be in a really different situation, right?
Yeah. Well, the 2023 offensive was launched with a great deal of fanfare and encouragement by the Western powers. The West was very heavily involved and was really pushing. I remember, there was talk of it. It was there was no surprise. Everybody knew it was going to happen. They even made something like a trailer about it that Ukrainians did ahead of time. But there was oh yeah, we're going to have this great offensive, and we're going to drive all the way to the Sea of Azov, and it's going to lead to a total collapse of the Russian army. They're going to flee in panic, and then we're going to march on to Crimea. And you got a lot of this big talk, not just from the Ukrainians, but a lot of Western military leaders as well. These units there was months and months of preparation. The Ukrainian units were trained in the West. They were supplied with, with the Leopard tanks and the Challenger tanks, and there was all talk about, again, how each of the Russians wouldn't be able to, when they saw one of these tanks coming over the hill or whatever, or coming across the field, they would just turn and flee. Everybody was told that Russian morale was very, very low. In the meantime, actually, in the months leading up to it, I think it was starting in the fall of 2022, the Russians actually worked on building at least 3 lines of fortifications. I believe in some areas they had up to 6 lines. They were very extensive, very formidable lines of defense. So they were waiting for it. They knew it was coming, and they were completely ready. And it was in June of 2023 that the Ukrainians launched this offensive, and it was, I remember the videos and the images for the first several days, where you just see what the Russians had done is that, ahead of that first line of fortifications, they had actually laid out very extensive and dense minefields. And then they also, they had small units occupy certain, small fortifications, really firing points. And this is what it was called by different names, like the crumple zone or security zone or whatever. It's just this area north of that first line of fortifications. And for the truth be told, is the Ukrainians never got past that. They never even got to that first line of fortifications. There may have been one. In fact, I think there was one video of one armored vehicle actually reaching, kind of rolling. I think it may have been disabled and just rolled up and kind of touched that first line of fortifications in close to the little village of Rabitana, which was fought over for a long, long time. They ended up they just got stuck in that security zone, and they just suffered, terrible losses. There were the minefields were very, very effective, and they had a terrible time getting through them. And then they fought some very intensive battles. Probably the most famous of it was over a very, very small village, Rabitana, which was again in front of that first line of fortifications. And that's as far as they got. And then eventually, like when it was all over several months ago, the Russians took back all of these places, they were very, very minor gains and at extremely high costs. So yeah, it was a total disaster. What it did is it just greatly weakened. At that time, the Ukrainian army was rather formidable. They had a lot of reserves. They had a lot of equipment. And the Russians, at that time, starting in the fall of 2022, began building up their forces because they realized, oh, this is a real war. Before it was this limited operation that was hopefully was going to lead to some sort of peace agreement. But now this is a real war. They mobilized. They began, accepting volunteers. They began building up their forces. And while they're doing this, they said, okay, yeah, there wasn't really any effort, I think with maybe one minor exception around Kupiansk in the north. There weren't really any offensive operations to speak of. They just held the line. They just waited for the Ukrainians to attack, and the Ukrainians obliged. They just kind of smashed against this wall. Actually, they didn't even get to the wall, but they expended a large number of men and equipment, a large amount of equipment there in front of that first wall. And so when it was all over, in the fall of 2023, then the Russians began to go on the offensive. They began to move at Avdiivka in particular, and that was a crucial battle. Again, I think that was the fortress city very close to Donetsk city. And when they took it in February of the following year. That really changed everything. The whole front began to unravel, and we're seeing the consequences now. So that's what happened with that offensive. Now, at least after the summer 2023 offensive, they did have defensive fortifications like the Ukrainians did that they could fall back to. But in the Sumy region, as you pointed out, they really don't. So, this was just idiotic. Again, I think we see Zelensky's fingerprints on it. The comedian, this guy is not a military man by any stretch of the imagination. So, not only did this operation never make sense, but clearly they didn't stop and think, well, what if we have to retreat? No preparations were made, and now they're in a terrible fix. So, the Russians are chasing them across the border, and it's pretty much, open all the way to Sumy. To the city of Sumy.
It seems very clear that after the summer 2023 offensive, that any possibility of Ukraine retaking the territories that Russia was currently holding is impossible.
Yeah.
That's where it should have ended. But obviously here we are now with how many more people have died. And it was clear that it's not an obtainable objective. And it's also, I think, a real point of contention with negotiations to be able to say that Russia's going to hold on to these territories. When we all know that that's the case. This was a done deal. It was a done deal from the beginning, really. Mm-hmm. And then after the summer 2023 offensive, people that may have been naive enough to believe that, oh, yeah, they watched that trailer the Ukrainians made, look at them, they're going all the way to Sea of Azov, they'll take Crimea, and who knows, they might just go straight to Moscow. Like you said, they didn't even reach the first line of defenses. That's when it should have ended. That's when it should have been clear to everybody. But why does it keep going? And we're still in the situation where you have forced conscription. Just the horror of this war, we don't know how many men have died on the Ukrainian side. 1 million that I hear of that are severely wounded or killed. It's just so awful, and we just keep it going, sending them into the meat grinder. It's unconscionable. It has to end. And I thought that Trump would be the person that would be. He voiced some sentiment saying I just want the killing to stop. I want people to die. I don't want people to die. Right? It's how is it that we as human beings that are involved in this conflict just can't come to terms with that these are real lives that we're playing with, that these are just every day more and more young men are dying. You have more and more young men that are the future of Ukraine, that are going to have children, that deserve to have fulfilling, fruitful lives, and they're just being extinguished every day. it's just I don't know. It's frustrating that it just keeps on going. Why can't we? Why can't it have? Why is there no humanity left in these leaders? I don't understand.
Yeah.
Why can't we? It's clear that it's over. It's clear that we can't. That Ukraine can't take back these territories. Ukraine can't win. Your only solution is potentially triggering World War III, where maybe 100 million people are going to kill, or the end of the world. Like that's clearly not an okay option, right? Why are we playing this game? What's driving it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I think maybe you have to point to two main culprits, and one is the Kiev regime itself. It is an ultra-nationalist kind of nihilistic, Russian-hating regime, and the people that have taken power they're not the people. They don't represent the majority of Ukrainians, who I think are just are like people everywhere. But the people who have taken power in this country, they've grown in power like ever since independence in 1991. But they really seized power, became a part of the government, and began to extend their control over the government with the Maidan coup in 2014. These people are in the grips of an ideological vision, that just does not admit of any compromise, and seems to regard death as well, again, as more glorious than life, especially so that they are willing to sacrifice their countrymen for this cause, and many of them are willing to die for it themselves. To in this effort to realize their really evil vision. Their hatred is so intense, again, that they would rather that they just all, that they would rather have utter destruction and mass death than actually bend the knee to Russia and to admit that Russia was the victor. We just see that in everything, the statements of Zelensky and other leaders of the country, and then of these, of the various ultra-nationalists. I mean, I think all these, Zelensky himself, he originally wasn't an ultra-nationalist, but he has become one. It's just that's the power that dominates now. I think we get a sense of what that power is like in the person of somebody who was assassinated actually just this morning in Odessa. His name was, I think, Gonol. And was just reading a little bit of, a biography of his. Not exactly a biography, but just a description of his activities over the last few years. He was one of the leaders of the Odessa massacre back in 2014. And that's when, there were some people after the Maidan coup. There were people in other parts of the country, in Odessa and, clearly in the Donbass, who protested. And, Donbass had led to an actual, secession and the beginnings of the Civil War. They, after when, okay, well, we'll at least set the Donbass aside. That's another history. Let's just talk about Odessa here. There were protests that were held in central Odessa against the Maidan coup. And this, the protesters were attacked by the ultra-nationalists, and the protesters fled into a trade union building right there in the center of Odessa. And then what the ultra-nationalists did is they set fire to it, and they stood outside laughing and jeering as they watched these people burn alive. The official count is 47. Others say that it might have been much higher, that 47 died in that fire. They're all innocents. Nobody's claiming otherwise. Even the European, Human Rights Commission or court just recently judged that the Ukrainian government was liable, needed to pay compensation to all the victims. Now, the very disturbing thing about this is that this event, there was never a proper investigation. Nobody was ever brought to account. Nobody was ever, arrested or detained. The organizers, the leaders, just continued to, in their activities, and that tells you something about this regime, right? One of those leaders again was Ganul, and he went on to, continue to persecute Russian speakers. He's been involved in vandalizing and destroying all kinds of Soviet and other Russia-linked monuments. He's been involved in the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And he also works with the TCC. These are the press gang guys. He beats up people who resist. And there's actually there's a picture out there where he beat up somebody who was in a gym and had been seized, who was trying to resist being forcibly sent to the front. And you see the guy, with bloody face, and here's Ganul just grinning in front of him. And you hear later, according to local reports, that this poor man was sodomized, while in detention prior to being sent to the front. Well, this guy was assassinated, Ganul. You can imagine the rage of many Odessans. The thing to say is like this tells you what kind of country you have, because somebody like that in a normal country would have been arrested a long, long time ago. But he's free to terrorize the population because he's actually working for the government. Maybe not officially, but he's actually enforcing, the preferences, the will of the government. That's the kind of government you have there, and that's part of the reason that we see this this insistence on war, war to the bitter end, a war that clearly will destroy Ukraine. That's the kind of people they live by a code of violence. But then we have the European leaders, and before that, the Biden administration, who, it's hard to explain them. We've tried to talk about them many times, but it's a combination of delusion, but also I think a real lack of empathy again, you recently just pointed out that Trump has said, hey, too many people are getting killed. This is terrible. And he's right. And when he said that, I was struck by the fact that I never heard anything like that from Biden or really from any other Western leader. It's just like I don't think the thought really crossed their mind. They just live in this world of fantasy. It's kind of a cartoon world in which, again, they're the good people. So they just suppress all information that might conflict with that vain assumption. And they pursue these policies that have very, very destructive consequences. But they seem to be incapable of reflection and of real human empathy. Again, we mentioned what's going on in Syria and, of course, and in Gaza. Again, there's just been this total lack of empathy or concern for the consequences of their policies. It's just that, in the end, they're so wedded to the notion that that they are the exceptional people that should be leading the world. They are the garden, the rest of the world is the jungle, to again quote Joseph Borrell, the former foreign minister of the EU. I think they're just so wrapped up in their own delusion that, again, they clearly just don't really have much of a grip of reality. We've talked earlier about maybe how this happened, and I think it's a product, I think, in good part, not entirely, but in good part of the unipolar moment. And they, eventually, they adopted the vision that the U.S. had, the exceptionalist vision, and they can't let go. They've actually become, more fervent believers in it than, certainly than the current U.S. administration is. So it's this Western exceptionalism plus this very, very ugly, violent Banderite ideology in Ukraine that accounts for what we're seeing.
Yeah, well, maybe we can't change anything about Western exceptionalism right away, but Putin does have the option to really root out the ultranationalists, right? I mean, like, he seems to be going very slowly, but shouldn't he just take the gloves off and just sort of, hit them with an Oreshnik, wherever these ultranationalists are hiding out in Kiev? for the sake of the Ukrainians, for the sake of the people that live in Ukraine that are under the heel of this horrific oppressive regime, talking about this guy in Odessa, just imagine living in this country. It is terrifying. If you're a man getting, pulled off the street, beat up, sodomized, sent to the front to die, this is awful. So I would expect to see some more type of armed resistance. I know, like within the Donbass militia has been very active in in this whole conflict, and they've been doing a lot of fighting. But you think that there would be kind of an underground resistance popping up more in places like Kharkov and Odessa, which are predominantly Russian-speaking cities.
Right.
That I'm sure they're terrified. Why aren't we seeing some of this type of resistance? They're living under this sort of this artificial ultra-nationalist Banderite regime that is destroying their culture and their people. Like, couldn't Russia be doing something to help this type of resistance? Say like, hey, take back. These press gang guys come after you. You take them out. These are the ones that are killing you and killing your country. You got to fight back against this regime. Why aren't we seeing that?
Well, I think it's just, again, it's an imbalance of forces. Clearly, there are a lot of people that are probably hate the government, hate the Ukrainian regime in places like Odessa and Kharkov, in the east and the south. I don't think there's any question about it. And they did resist in the past, but this is it's a totalitarian or nearly totalitarian regime. The secret police is everywhere. It's powerful. A lot of the resources of the government are dedicated to the secret police and maintaining this reign of terror. We have seen some resistance. There was the assassination this morning, but there also have been cases. I haven't seen any recently, but I remember a month or two ago of TCC. That's again to say that forced conscription service in Ukraine. TCC vehicles being destroyed. There a number of them were, and I think you could say, well, that's maybe there are individual acts that maybe. They were carried out by a resistance group. In some cases, I know that actually local resistance groups claimed responsibility, claimed credit for these attacks. So there is some, but it's very minor. I think it's just they really they really can't do very much. They just don't have the power. But I think what they're doing is that they're actually providing a lot of important intelligence to the Russians. When you hear about, for example, a hotel being hit, why do they strike the hotel? Because they know that there's a meeting taking place there, or that a large number of mercenaries arrive there and are being housed there for, the next few days. How do they know that? I bet it's people in the local resistance that are passing this information on to the Russians. I think that's mainly what they're doing. Now, I know there are people that are critical of Putin, saying that he's going too slow. Actually, there are quite a few people in Russia that believe that, I don't know. Again, as a president, he's got to look at it, the big picture, and consider everything. And he's got a lot of information. I know that's often used as an excuse. I remember it was used as an excuse for George W. Bush. Well, he clearly knows things. We found out he didn't know anything. He didn't even understand the difference between the Shias and Shiites. But I'm willing to give the benefit of doubt to Putin. He's obviously a very, very smart man who has the command of the facts. You say it's going slowly, but in a way it isn't. It's just, what we have to remember is this is a war of attrition. So the main objective is not to take territory at this point, at this stage in the war, but to destroy the fighting ability of the enemy. And if you're looking at that, sadly, part of that is soldiers killed or severely wounded, and it's also destruction of equipment. It's actually, if you measure it in those terms, and I think that's really how the Russians are measuring it, it's proceeding at a pretty good clip. And then once you've actually destroyed the ability of the enemy to fight, then you can emphasize territorial, capture. And I think that's what we're going to see.
Right, but I'm just from the moral standpoint. I think wouldn't the moral solution for Russia would be to do sort of more of a targeted decapitation type strikes to end this regime? Because you said that the problem is these ultranationalists. This ideology needs to be rooted out. You're sure you're in a war of attrition. Russia's going to win this war, but you've killed 1 million Ukrainians, which many of these Ukrainians, I think, probably would have harbored no real resentment towards Russia to begin with. These are the ones that
Yeah,
are being, a
no.
lot of them are being pulled off the street and sent to the meat grinder. No, in my mind, yeah, okay, it's a victory for Russia, but it's a sad one.
Yeah.
It's a one that results in the deaths of so many young men that should not have died. And if you could have saved those lives, wouldn't that by doing something like I don't know, maybe it would Putin has to calculate it triggering something larger. But I just feel like there could have been another way the problem is even if you run out of all the men, well, the only people left in power are the ultranationalist men because they've killed everybody else. Like you still have that problem. You have to get rid of them. You have to get rid of this regime. These are the ones that have this cultish death wish that just every fiber of their being is just we got to kill Russians and we hate everything Russia. Well, you can't have that if you're on Russia's border because Russia's not going to put up with it. So it's just going to keep going, and we don't want it. I don't want any more people that don't want to fight, that want to make peace with Russia. Those are the ones that are dying now. Those are the ones that are being forced conscripted. So I just hope that there's some way that maybe we can get a negotiated settlement. But I think if not, then I feel like the right moral solution would be for Putin to do something quick. Like he's been patient for a long time. If we can just, I don't know, maybe it would solve the problem if we can get the people in Ukraine to rise up and take their country back. I don't know, maybe I'm just being idealistic. But and even just with this whole negotiation ceasefire deal, it just feels weird to me as well that we are the ones supposedly mediating between Ukraine and Russia, but we are co-belligerent in this. We are part of this negotiating. So it just that just in itself seems wrong. Couldn't the U.S. and Russia agree and Ukraine agree to a third party negotiator like Saudi Arabia itself to mediate? Because we are a co-belligerent, right? I mean, we can't just we're acting like we're trying to make peace. It's like well you're the ones at the same time we're giving them these new upgraded long range bombs to Ukraine and sanctioning Russia. It's like, well, we're not a neutral party in this conflict, so it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Before I address that, I just want to, you mentioned a lot of young men die. I think we have to remind ourselves a lot of these are middle-aged men, even older men. They're a lot of, I think the average, I haven't heard anything about this recently, but several months ago it was stated that in several reports that the average age of a Ukrainian soldier was like 46, 47.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, again, a lot of these are men in their 40s and 50s, and sometimes they're not supposed to be grabbing 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds, but they do that. Some of them are over 60 and even over 70 in some cases. But anyway, that's just something I thought I should mention. Over this pretense of being a disinterested third party is ridiculous, and it does. I find it very annoying, and I'm sure the Russians find it very annoying too. It's just like, you two guys just stop fighting and wait a second, really you're the one who started the fight. This is your proxy. Is really the U.S. that if it wasn't for the U.S., this war would never have started. If the Ukrainians understood a long time ago that they were on their own, that they would have made peace with the Russians. They would have maintained their neutral status. Remember when they gained their independence, part of the condition was that they would stay neutral, and that was written into the Constitution. But with Maidan and the support from the U.S. Yeah, the neutrality was lost. And again, it's a long history that we've talked about before, but it's the U.S. has been involved in every step, and that led up to this war. They clearly provoked this war. If you want to point the finger to one country, as I said earlier, you really should point it to the U.S. So you are not a disinterested third party. You are a co-belligerent, as you say, and not only are you a co-belligerent, but you're a co-belligerent on the losing side. So no, you don't get to dictate terms. They say you have to start acknowledging the reality. And you have to start accepting the terms that the victor is offering you. If you had accepted them earlier, it would have been better. There are many, many states. We could have avoided the war altogether. We could have stopped it at an early stage. We could have stopped it after after the failure of the 2023 summer offensive. And in any of those cases, you could have gotten a deal for Ukraine that was a lot better than the deal that you're going to get now. And the trajectory is obvious. This is the course that you've been on. You've been pushing this proxy war. And if you continue to push it, it'll continue to get worse for Ukraine. You can stop now, or you can continue on this losing self-destructive course. No, you're not the peacemaker. You're a co-belligerent. Let's start being real about this. Sometimes, again, you do get some statements from U.S. leaders that admit that. I think was it Rubio himself that admitted it was a proxy war, or it was some. Yeah, right.
I think it was Rubio.
Right.
So, what path are we going to take? Continue destruction of Ukraine, or do you think we're going to end this? I just want this to end. It's
Yeah, it is horrible. It is horrible. Again, it's like what's happening in Gaza is horrible, and that's mostly the vast majority of the victims are civilians. Right. In Ukraine, it's different. The vast majority are combatants. This is a real war between, armies that are fighting each other. This is not just an attack on a civilian population. It's nothing like that. I mean, the Ukrainians try to have attacked the Russian population, but they just don't have the means to inflict really significant damage to. They've killed hundreds, really, over the course of going back to 2014, thousands of civilians, but they can't do, anything of the kind of carnage that we see in Gaza. But anyway, so most of the deaths and severe injuries are among soldiers, the vast majority in this war. But that doesn't make it really somehow okay. That's horrible. Again, these are real people like you and me, and a lot of them were never really committed to this or just didn't understand. It didn't make them bad people. That especially at the beginning, they thought they're just defending their country and signed up, and then later on didn't sign up as they started to understand what's going on, just got grabbed and sent to the front. Again, I'm not going to shed any tears for the ultranationalists, and I think you're saying I don't think. Like taking out the leadership, again, there may be all kinds of geopolitical ramifications of that. Again, with maybe Russia has to consider the viewpoints of its allies, but then also the danger of serious escalation. So for various reasons, they haven't tried to do that, and I don't know that it would really solve any problems because you do have these ultra-nationalist units, throughout the country that have a great deal of power within the military. But I think, when they do target them, like if they hear about a gathering of ultra-nationalists, that's put at the top of the list of missile targets. So they have been going after them, and a lot of these casualties, many of them are conscripts, but many of them are ultra-nationalists too. I mean, these are the guys who actually want to fight, and there's a lot of them are on the front lines fighting, and a lot of them are being killed.
Right. Yeah, I wish there was just a way to target the ultra-nationalist ideology. Maybe it requires sort of more of a grassroots armed resistance to take back the streets. But, when we talk about, what's happening in Gaza, 70% of the casualties are women and children. It's awful. You can't get much worse than that.
Right.
And then what's happening in Ukraine, you're right, it's soldiers. But if you are engaged in forced conscription, press gauges, and that's basically like civilian adjacent. You know what I mean? It's like they're not really soldiers. You know, they were a civilian until you pulled them out of their bed or out of their car, and then beat them up and sent them off to the front. You know, it's awful. War is just so horrible, and we get so detached from it. We all just sit here and we like to talk about it, and we read about it on the news, and you see people. It's infuriating watching the BBC just say we cannot award the aggressor, Russia. We cannot. You know, we have to fight back. It's like it's all good and fine for you, but what about all these kids that are dying? Or all it's scary. It's scary. It's scary how humans can engage in war. Yeah, I was listening to Daryl Cooper. I was on Joe Rogan. It's great. He's a great guest. He's really good at talking about history, and he touches some third rails, you know, when it comes to World War II and talking about Israel and stuff. So it was great having him on there. But he's very good at just empathizing with the human aspect of it and just making you realize, just like when you read about these stories, World War I, World War II, like in the Battle of the Somme. Like 1 million people died in just that one battle. Over 1 million people. Like 600,000 French and Brits. I think 60,000 Brits died on one day. Just like how humans can do that. And it's just scary that it still happens. And it might happen again. And you can see the forces at play that allow it to happen. And that they're right now, those voices, they're yapping, and they've been yapping pretty loud to try that could do something horrendous, you know, and cause millions, tens of millions of people to die. And we need to clamp down that voice that says that pushes that ideology that rationalizes the deaths of millions, tens of millions, you know, of potentially the whole world, because of just some stupid idea you have in your head, you know.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they rationalize it, but they are. It's because they live in this
hijacked.
They live in this cartoon world where they, you know, it seems like they can't actually admit the real risks of their policies. They can't see them. Unlike previous generations, again, in the Cold War, people understood the risk and people were genuinely concerned, and that's why we got those treaties. But it's just like there's that healthy fear that existed then does not exist anymore. Again, these people have seemed to have really lost their grip on reality. So they're what they say is like it couldn't happen. You know, it's if we actually take this too seriously, then we're somehow it's a Russian talking point, basically. You know, it's just like, you know, actually this worry about about nuclear war is actually to adopt a Russian talking point. That's virtually, you know, I don't think that's actually much of an exaggeration. That's the way they look at it. There's so much caught up in the ideology and the narrative that they're just not grounded in reality anymore.
Right. Yeah, I think we need to take a reminder to step back and just kind of realize that we're playing with these human lives. We get caught up with these specific human interest stories, and that's what the media is so good at, manipulating people. They'll take one, you know, Ukrainian atrocity, or they'll show in Israel the hostages or the Bebis family baby, you know, and it's horrible. It's awful. I am not condoning it, but to multiply that by 1 million, though, on what we're seeing, you know, that each one of these men that have died, that they might be a father, they have dreams and aspirations, might have a girlfriend, they want to build a business, they want to build their own life, and it's just, we're snuffing them out like just willy-nilly. And that's what's so sick, is that our elites just don't care. They don't care at all. It's just like, just let them all die. Let them all die. They don't give a damn. Yeah. We got to remember that these are all people, the Ukrainians and the Russians, you know, the Palestinians.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know. That's just human nature, I guess. Well, maybe we'll always have war. You think that we'd be enlightened enough at this point to settle our differences, but. Well, I wanted to end on a happy note.
That's not particularly happy.
So, do you have anything you want to say before we call it a day?
No, I agree that it is important. It's kind of easy sometimes to almost, take not exactly a pleasure, but, I guess, just to survive emotionally, since sometimes you have to detach yourself from the reality to analyze and understand what's going on. I think you can't constantly, be empathizing, but you do. It's important to stop, every once in a while, actually frequently, and say, hey, this is really awful. Again, imagine what this is like for these individuals involved. I think that you're right. It's completely, it's necessary, and we need to do that again and again.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to empathize on a macro scale. When you hear one individual horrific story, yeah, understand that this is happening across the whole conflict, multiply it by 10,000, 100,000. That's what we're dealing with. And then you can kind of understand the seriousness of this. And then you make that decision. Is it really worth it? People don't understand large numbers. It's just like that Madame Albright, 500,000 Iraqi children died. Do you think it's worth it? Yeah, it's bad, but we think it's worth it. Really? You think that's worth it? 500,000 babies. Do you understand what that means? What you're saying right there? That's the problem. People don't understand. They just see that. They'll see one story on the news, and they care about that, but they don't care about it on the whole large scale. Well, that's how you need to frame it, and that's why you need to understand that ending this conflict is so important.
Yeah. Well, it's also because that there is a deliberate effort to dehumanize the enemies, and in our case, like the enemies of Zionism, that's what. Of Israel, and that's what explains Madeleine Albright's comment. She would care greatly about the death of one Jewish Israeli child. Let's be honest, but she manages to not really to just regard as an abstraction, an unfortunate but necessary abstraction, the death of 500,000 Iraqi children.
Yeah. Okay, well, I can only get so depressed, so let's end it there, Dad.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Guys, thanks for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please check out my website, nobliski.io. You can look at the pinned comment below. It's something that I think you'll find useful. Even my dad uses it. My wife uses it. Instead of Googling things, you should be using this website because you get access to OpenAI, Perplexity, Anthropic, DeepSeek. There's hundreds of models that you can use. It's what I use to create the thumbnail images, things like this. And the greatest thing about it is there's no rate limits. There are no subscription fees. It's free to try out and use. You get free tokens every day. So if you're not a heavy AI user, you will never have to pay for anything. But this is really my passion project. I really want to get it off the ground, and I think you guys would like it. So yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think. And if you have time to download the apps and give it 5 stars, that'd mean a lot to me as well. Thanks a lot.